Hey Dan, this is the second video that I told you I was going to make. I promised not to talk about swimming much, but I do want to respond to your atheism and religion video. I must apologize that I'm not sure this video will be up to your intellectual par, but I will, with my machiniblic attempt to foozle my way down your intellectual fairway, so to speak. That being said, I thought it would be best if I started off with a joke. One of Mike's favorites, in fact. So this this guy is moving into a new neighborhood, and he's loading stuff in and out of his moving van, and the next door neighbor has been watching him kind of all day, moving in and out, and so the neighbor comes up and leans across the fence and introduces himself and says, "Hi, hey, my name's Jim." And the new guy says, "Well, my name's Dan. Nice to meet you." And Jim says, "Well, what brings you to town? What, why'd you decide to move here?" And Dan says, "Well, I'm teaching deductive reasoning at the university." And Jim says, "Deductive reasoning must be in logic or something." And Dan says, "Yeah, actually it is. It's actually in the philosophy department." And Jim says, "Well, what is deductive reasoning? I've heard of it. I just don't know what it is." And Dan says, "Well, let me give you an example. I think it'll help you understand." And he says, "I see that you have a doghouse in your yard." And Jim's like, "Yeah." And Dan says, "Well, from that I think reasonably could deduce that you have a dog." And Jim says, "Well," and Dan says, laughing, "So that's the easy one." He said, "Now from there I can reasonably deduce that you have children." And the guy's like, "Yes." And from there I can reasonably deduce that you are married. And Jim's like, "Yes." And from there I can reasonably deduce that you are heterosexual. Jim's like, "Well, yeah." And Dan says, "That is deductive reasoning." Jim's like, "Oh, all right." So later that evening, Jim goes down to the bar and sees a buddy of his, and they're sitting down at the bar having a drink, and a buddy of his says to Jim, "Hey, I see somebody bought that house next to you. Have you met the guy?" And Jim says, Yeah, I have. His name is Dan. He teaches deductive reasoning at the university. He moved here for that job." And Jim's buddy says, "Well, what the hell is deductive reasoning?" And Jim says, "Well, let me give you an example." He said, "Do you have a doghouse?" Jim's buddy says, "No." "Bag?" So that is one of Mike's favorite jokes. Yeah, you might not want to repeat that one at school.
I might repeat it in quiet at school.
So the hard part about those kinds of jokes, of course, is they were great to tell with Mike, because being gay gave him a certain latitude to tell those jokes, which, of course, I have considered myself having that latitude. The one about the guy who walks into the bar, right, and says, sees these two women sitting at a table together, and he says to the bartender, "Hey," keeps looking over his shoulder, "the women, give me 3 beers." And the bartender's like, "Dude, don't waste your time. They're lesbians." And the guy's like, "Well, so give me the beers." So he grabs the 3 beers and he walks over and says, "So, I hear you pretty ladies are from the Middle East." Yeah. Of course, the alternate ending to that one is he walks over and says, "So, I hear you ladies are actresses." So anyway, But on topic, how many atheists does it take to screw in a light bulb? 2. One to screw in the light bulb, and the second one to run the video camera to prove to the fundamentalists that God didn't do it. Ba-dum-bum. So anyway, so as to your video, when you're saying that the reason to not believe in religion is because it has been such a cause for suffering, it just doesn't seem to follow one to the other. Because to suggest that, I think that to believe that religion doesn't exist because it causes suffering, I think is what you were saying. Is that correct? Now, to choose not to be a member of a religion because you feel that it causes suffering, that I think is a more reasonable conclusion to draw. If you can look in the past and say, okay, all of these organized religions have been a cause to suffering, then I think it's reasonable to say I don't want to be a member of any religion because, they all end up, because of power and what that does to humans, I don't want to be a part of that. But to say that religion doesn't exist or it shouldn't exist because, I don't know, I'm not sure about that conclusion to jump to saying, again, that religion is false, or I don't know, I'm not quite sure what your point was there, but but also I think there's a flaw in that logic to suggest that because it sounds like the implication is that religion is the sole cause of suffering, and I think you were making the argument that of course it's not the sole cause of suffering. Any organization, any unifying concept, I think you called it, can be the cause of suffering, simply because of the greater power that's that comes from the unifying concept. We saw that at the riot in Pullman. The unifying concept was, whether it was alcohol or whether it was this sudden idea of, I'm not sure what the unifying concept actually was, but what it became was this: all of these people came together and realized that together they had a power that they lacked apart, and with that power they caused a great deal of suffering. Acute suffering, but suffering nonetheless. So, to suggest that universities should be abolished because of the occasional student riot would be like saying all religion should be abolished because in the history of man, religion has been implicit in the cause of suffering. So I'm not sure I agree with that. But atheism, it's interesting because I have actually been listening to Stephen Hawking's book. I've been listening to it on tape, Brief History of Time, and Hawking's is interesting in that I find him very. I find Hawking's very even-handed when it comes to dealing with the possibility of God, and he really never talks about religion, but he also often talks about the possibility of God, and he's talking about God in terms of. It's actually interesting. Let's take a step back. When the first theories of the Big Bang came out, the Catholic Church actually
Actually, I have one more.
embraced that theory because they felt that it was an argument for the prime mover theory, the theory of God, that the universe hadn't always existed, that it had a definite beginning in time. And they found that was an argument, a metaphysical argument for God, which is really interesting. So, Hawkins wasn't saying none of this stuff exists, God doesn't exist, but he's certainly allowing for that in his, in his treatment of really, macro physics and quantum mechanics. It's really interesting. I mean, the math is really difficult, obviously, especially when you start talking about gluons and quarks. And I'm mostly lost at that point. But it is interesting nonetheless. So anyway, so it just seems like atheism defines itself as being the absence of something else. And it's like saying darkness exists. Well, if darkness is only an absence of light, then it has no substance or meaning outside of light. So atheism, without the concept of God, couldn't exist. And yet they contend that they believe in just that. So it's sort of like defining yourself as the absence of something you don't believe in. Or defining yourself by something you don't believe in. And it just, it's like, it doesn't make any sense to me. So, and so you're saying the only logical stand is agnosticism. And I don't know. I don't know about that. I don't know about enough about agnosticism to give you an argument back. But you did say that something about we all worship. One of the Baha'i writings saying we all worship a God of our own making. Actually, there's a poet who said, Jesus has a small nose like unto mine, and your Jesus has a hooked nose like unto thine, which is essentially the same thing. This was written in the 15th century, I think, or 16th century, which is the same idea, right? That we're all worshiping our God is in our likeness. My Jesus is an Anglo, and your Jesus is has dreads, and it's just sort of the way Jesus is. He's anyway. So I don't know if I actually treated if this was actually a response that was really worthy of being a response. But yeah, I would rather not dwell on defining myself as the contrary to something else. I would rather be the affirmation of something rather than the what's the opposite of affirmation? What's the opposite of affirmation?
I don't know what affirmation means.
Affirming, rather than being the opposite of a negative, I guess. So, anyway, on that note, it's 9:05. It's time for me to go to bed. My dad turns 70 on the 17th. Keep that in mind, of this month. And I've got several thousand yards to swim tomorrow. So, from Winona, signing off as still dead, my friend.